Hello.
Rabbi Gluck.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Richard Dawkins. How do you do?
Thanks, but fine. Nice to meet you. Please come in.
Good, thank you very much. Ready. Rabbi Gluck, tell me a bit about the community here of Hasidic Jews. How far does it go back?
I mean, the community isn't just for Hasidic Jews. It's much broader than that. The community is made up of many different elements and people from different backgrounds. Jews have lived in Stamford Hill for many, many years, because of its proximity to the East End. So people moved from the East End, moved north, and many of them settled in Stamford Hill and Stoke Newington.
I'm curious about this idea of a community within a community. So the children in this community, they all go to Jewish schools. I mean, the Jewish
I would say the
children.
vast majority of children here go to Jewish schools.
Yes.
That is for historical reasons that Jews have wanted to continue to perpetuate the message of Judaism, which is very dear and precious to us.
Yes. And what about marrying out? I mean, how far back would you go for a typical Jewish child in this community before you came to a non-Jewish ancestor, if you went back? If you see what I mean.
I mean, that's difficult to say. I mean, the Jews do allow others in, and there are many people who are converts to Judaism. So I think you'd find many more than one would imagine.
Right. Okay. So you have a tradition which goes longitudinally down through the population within a larger population which has a number of different traditions. That's quite interesting to me as a biologist, because on a genetic level that happens when no, I think I'm going to stop and rephrase that. I got
Get an idea of that from
By the way, this is actually my synagogue.
Oh, right.
So
Okay.
therefore you actually have that advantage as well.
We're
That's actually me.
Okay, all right, okay.
I mean, this is actually me, but that's an artist's impression of my back, which might be the best part of me.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and let's just ask a bit more detail about the education.
So, how old would a typical Jewish child be when he knows that he's a Jew?
I mean, at 8 days old, boys are circumcised. So
They're not aware,
really,
yes.
and I mean, Judaism is something which is lived. It's not a religion in the same sense as Christianity, which is limited to certain areas of one's life. Judaism actually encompasses and permeates every aspect of a Jew's life.
That would be true of Islam as well, wouldn't it, I think?
That you have to speak to the Islamic scholar
Yes.
about,
Yes.
But I presume so.
Yes. So when you say every aspect of life, I know that applies to diet, but what other sorts of things?
Every element, I mean, from prior to conception to death. And every single aspect in 24 hours in the Code of Jewish Law, in Jewish teachings, there are ways how to do it, because Judaism, of being monotheistic, believes that everything in the world is ultimately connected with God. And the purpose of a Jew is to reveal that connection.
But it doesn't go to the details like how you clean your teeth and sort of mundane details.
I mean, every aspect, a Jew is inspired by the teachings of the Torah.
Right. Remind me, in terms of the Old Testament, which I'm familiar with, which books are the Torah?
The Torah, in Jewish tradition, there are two parts of the Torah. There's the written Torah, which you might call the Hebrew Scriptures.
Right.
And there is the oral Torah, which is the Talmud, the Talmudic tradition. And both these elements make up the Torah, the living instruction for the Jewish people, because Torah comes from the Hebrew word hora'ah, which means instruction. So the Torah's basic principle is to instruct us in God's will, how we can apply it to our daily lives.
But in terms of the books that I'm familiar with, like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy,
Yes.
it's all those books,
Yes.
and the prophets as well?
Yes.
Yes, so it's the whole of what Christians call the Old Testament.
Correct.
Yes, I see.
And in the oral law as well, because we believe that God gave simultaneously the oral law and the written law. He gave the written law as general points, and the oral law to explain exactly what is meant by these points.
And that's passed down from rabbi to rabbi, is that how it works?
I mean, the Talmud is actually committed to writing, was committed to writing about 1,500, 2,000 years ago. And then we study it, we innovate in it, we find new concepts, new perspectives within it.
New interpretations.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, similar to like in science, we have the general rules of science, and then the scientist works within that and can innovate within that.
Right. And what criteria do you use when innovating to decide whether it's a good innovation or a bad innovation?
One discusses it with others.
Right.
And if people can't show that it's wrong, so then it's accepted, so then it becomes part of the Jewish tradition.
Wrong by what criteria? By
in other words, that they're looking backwards and looking in the broad outline of Jewish teachings, that this would fit in. But in Judaism there have been many radical thinkers who have made tremendous innovations within the framework, within the parameters of Jewish teaching.
It sounds a bit like the way civil law evolves.
In many ways.
Yes. Yeah. Now, a child goes to school what sort of age?
I mean, a lot of kids go to kindergarten or to
Yes.
playgroup, and to school, I presume, about 5.
Yes. And at kindergarten and playgroup?
About 2, 3.
Yes. And what do they learn in the way of Judaism, that kindergarten and playgroup?
I mean, they learn how to read. They learn the letters of the alphabet. They learn basic concepts, and then over time, one develops this further. I mean, Jewish schooling actually goes back thousands of years. At first, the obligation was for the parents to teach the child. Then, because of social conditions, there were kids who didn't have parents. What to do about them? So they instituted schools that all children should have the benefit of education. I mean, in other words, there was universal education about 2,000 years ago.
Right. Okay. Does it strike you as odd that you happen to have been born into a Jewish family and the children that you instruct were as well, and I happen to have been born into a Christian family and somebody else is born into a Muslim family? So we tend to, as children, we tend to believe the traditions of the society into which we happen to have been born, which are different from the other traditions. Could something so accidental as that be true?
I think it's further than that. I think there's the concept of osmosis as well, that there is the conscious acceptance or acknowledgement of tradition, but then there's also what we learn without noticing from our surroundings, from the society in which we grow up. And I think there's a basic difference between growing up in a majority culture or minority culture. In a majority culture, one takes for granted. In a minority culture, since we are different, we have to think, why am I different? What is going on? Why am I as I am? Which a person in a majority culture very often doesn't have that luxury.
I do see that, yes. But on the face of it, since these different traditions believe different things, I mean, things that really matter about the cosmos, about the universe, about time, about space, about morality, wouldn't it somehow seem more sensible if children, as it were, looked them all over and then made their choice when they grew up, rather than this automatic assumption that a child shall be brought up in the tradition of its forefathers?
I think the automatic assumption is much more true within, let's call it Western culture. Being the dominant culture, it's taken for granted that this is a normal way of behaving, that this is the way how all people behave. If someone behaves different, they're seen as eccentric, they're seen as oddballs, they're seen as marginal. And I think that to contend with that, with the weight of that cultural dominance,
yes.
I think it's important for a minority to be able to have a space where it can express itself, where it can learn about itself. And then when it goes out into the world, which will all go out in the world, I mean, despite my accent, I'm a Londoner, and many aspects of my character, people say, oh, you're very English, because of various layers within me. And I think that in order to deal with that situation, one does need to have a space where one can relate to one's own tradition, to the philosophy, to the way of life, to the customs, to the thrust of who one is.
I have great sympathy with that, and I can easily see that when you have a tradition that goes back so far, it would seem very precious and very well worthwhile preserving, and very sad when it gets lost. I think I feel the same about languages that get lost. I mean, language like the Welsh language or the Irish language, which are perilously close to disappearing in the next century or so, that is very sad. And I can see the same thing would be true of an ancient tradition like Judaism. Nevertheless, there are certain truths about the cosmos which are either true or false. And one ought to be able to teach children to evaluate the evidence for them about the age of the universe, about where life comes from and things like that, without having to push them into a position of divided loyalties between evidence-based science, which is obviously where I'm coming from on the one hand, and the tradition on the other. I mean, couldn't you preserve the customs, the traditions, the history, without somehow imposing upon the children views about the universe which modern science would say are simply false?
I would say impose upon a Jew anything. I would say that's something which is impossible. I think scientifically impossible. Jews are very independent by our nature for various reasons. I would say that the Jewish gene is very much a gene which swims against the current.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. But nevertheless, these tiny children...
And I think that as far as studying the universe and studying the cosmos, that every single Jew would have a much... would have reflected and thought about the questions of evolution more than your average Briton, for obvious reasons, because we have to deal with it. We believe that God created the world in 6 days. We know about evolution. Every single Jewish kid knows about evolution and has thought about it and has studied it and has looked at it and has thought, what's going on here? So therefore, I think it's a much healthier situation, and a situation which opens up one's mind and engages one with these issues.
Well, those are very laudable aims, and I'd love to think that was true, but how many of the children who come up through your system, your school system, end up believing in evolution?
I think that the majority don't believe in evolution. But at the same time, it isn't they don't believe because they don't know about it. They know about it, and still they believe in what we believe because we have open discussions about it. We discuss it. Many works have been written about it. I remember myself as a child of 11, 12, thinking about these issues and going in the street and reflecting upon it. And I wouldn't say that I'm unique. I would say that this is quite normal. None of us live in a bubble. We're not Amish. We are very much part of the modern world. And therefore we do deal with issues that are with currents in modern thought and in society.
Well, once again, I accept these are very laudable aims. I'm just forgive me for being sceptical of the practice because, I mean, the 6 days you're talking about, how long ago do you think those 6 days were?
We believe that was 5,765 years.
Yes.
But of course, we're coming from a starting point that God created the world. Like he created man. He didn't create man as an atom. We believe that he created man and woman as mature human beings. We believe that God created a mature world. I mean, even Darwin believed in God, but he believed that God started off with a basic world, and then God wanted it to evolve. What we're saying is that God started it from the point it was. It's like, for example, a theatre set. You can say that in order to have Hamlet, one needs to have a graveyard. In order to have the graveyard, one needed a generation to live and to die. Or you can say you start with the set as it is.
Yes, I didn't want to get too much into this. I must correct your suggestion that Darwin believed in God. He believed in God as a young man. He didn't believe in God as an older man when he wrote The Origin of Species.
Yeah, but still, the point I think is still.
Well, your point about creating the world, as it were, ready-made. You will have problems when you come to things like fossils, when you come to things like radioactive clocks, which tell us that the world is 4.5 billion years old.
But again, I mean, in science you have various views which are not just indifferent of a few years, but you have differences of millions or billions of years. So therefore, it must be something wrong with the science if various aspects of science are so unempirical and out of touch with each other.
The disagreements among scientists are about millions and billions. They're not about a mere 5,000
No,
years.
but millions and billions, which is even a much longer span of time.
But you realise that the children are being taught. They're being brought up in a world, and they're being taught that the entire world began after what archaeologists would recognise as the agricultural revolution. I mean, these children are being brought up in a very distorted world indeed. It's nothing to do with Judaism. This is true of fundamentalist Christians in the United States. It's true of fundamentalist Muslims all over the Muslim world. Children all over the world are being taught something which is manifestly false, as anybody who looks objectively at the science can tell you. And I worry about children being victims of this kind of what I can only describe as miseducation.
I find the terms as distorted and miseducation rather disturbing. I think that Judaism has its tradition. I think there are various scientists who have their tradition. And I think to get on a high horse and to say that only my tradition is correct without really exploring
I would hate to
the
do
other
that,
tradition.
but it isn't just a matter of tradition. We're not talking about tradition. We're talking about evidence. Tradition means that wise men of the past wrote things down, discussed, debated, and passed it on to the next generation who discussed and debated. Perhaps they had revelations. Perhaps they read holy books and discussed it. But that isn't evidence. The science is not a tradition. Science is looking at evidence, and the evidence is, in this case, extremely clear. There are other cases where it's not extremely clear, but in the matter of the world being billions of years old and not mere thousands of years old, the science is totally clear.
I don't think it's clear. I mean, it's still called the theory of evolution.
Well, it's called that, but that's in a very technical sense.
But still, it's called that, and it's not called the law of evolution.
Well, I will call it the fact of evolution. And
you're a fundamentalist believer.
No, I'm not a fundamentalist believer.
Because in English language, it is called the theory of evolution.
In a special technical philosophical sense, it's also a theory that the world is round and not flat. It's also a theory that the heart.
I mean, Jews always believed that the world was round when the rest of the world thought it was flat.
Well,
and I presume at that time you would have come to me and said the world is flat, and how come you believe the world is round? Because at the time that was a scientific the orthodoxy that the world was flat.
Science, of course,
Judaism
changes.
at the time believed the world was round. So I'm sure if we would have had this conversation then, you would have said, how can you believe the world is round? Science knows it's flat.
Only if you take science to be a tradition. Science has evidence. In that time, the evidence was bad evidence. The evidence improves. The evidence comes in as the centuries go by.
Obviously, there'll come a time when you'll come to me and say, this conversation was based on bad evidence.
Well,
today,
in some
today in
respects,
10 years' time,
yeah.
we'll say, okay, no,
Yes.
your view was correct. And
Science changes, and there will be things that change, but there are certain things which the evidence is so strong that they won't change. There are many things where science is very uncertain, and I would hate to give the impression that science is categorical or over certain. There are lots of things where it's not certain. But the age of the Earth, 5,000 years, I mean, that is, I'm sorry, Rabbi, that is ridiculous. There are other things where no doubt you're right, but
I would say that this conversation would need a much longer period of time to discuss it. Because
Well, I agree with that.
We're dealing with many different issues. I mean, carbon dating, it's based on if the world had always had the same amount of radioactivity. There were changes within periods of time. I think the issue is much more complex than just being put down as it is. There are many questions, many areas that need to be looked into in order to come to grips with the real issues.
Why don't we agree that there's a magnificent tradition in Judaism which we could all benefit by studying? You have said that it changes, that as the generations go by, teachers and rabbis reinterpret and relook at it. Why don't you reinterpret this one and say that the book of Genesis is some kind of a symbolic, poetic origin myth of great beauty, but it was never intended to be taken literally, or if it was, the intention was wrong. And you can reinterpret it as a modern rabbi and interpret it in the light of modern science and teach the children something which is closer to not what the surrounding tradition is saying, I don't want that at all, which is closer to the evidence.
I mean, we look at the Torah as being the work of God, as being the work of the revelation of the Creator, of the one who created the world for a purpose. And therefore what it says in the Torah is actually meaningful. And that is what Jews have always held so precious, is that this truth is something that has the power to make a better world, to make a more civilized world, to make a more cultured world, a world where people care for each other, where people are not automatons, are not victims of circumstance, but have a clear mission and purpose in life. And this is very precious to us, this message.
But isn't that compatible with a more symbolic or metaphorical interpretation of the book of Genesis?
I mean, I think once it starts with metaphor, one gets into, there are metaphorical elements within the Torah which are very important and very beautiful, but at the same time there is the basic meaning, the straightforward meaning, which is basic. I mean, if we say we start metaphor, then it says do not kill also becomes a metaphor. There is a metaphorical element to it as well, but at the same time there is a basic element to it as well.
But couldn't you say that the story of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent, is some sort of symbolic account of a war between good and evil, for example?
There is that element as well in it.
Didn't have to happen 5,000 years ago. It could, I mean, maybe it never actually happened, but still has a truth for us today.
But I think the truth of something is much stronger when it actually happened. Because if it's only a symbol, there are symbolic elements within the story, and there are mystical elements within the story, but there is the reality of the story, because when something is real, so then it's something that actually touches each one of us. In other words, if we just say it's a metaphor, so then a metaphor, so it's a nice story, it's a nice concept, it's a nice ideal, but we live in the real world. we live in a world where real things happen. And therefore, by looking at it as something real, so then it has a complete different message. It has much more weight. It has a reality that can actually inspire and instruct us in our daily lives.
Well, what you're saying is that it has a better moral power if it really happened. But
Yes.
my problem is it didn't really happen, and therefore I'm trying to rescue you from, as it were, nailing your colours to an impossible mast.
Professor Dawkins, I'm very impressed that you're the new Messiah. And I appreciate your desire
Look,
to redeem
I'm
the
not
world,
talking as
but
me.
but at the same time, I think that the Jewish people have always had. We've always had our critics, and we've always had our difficulties.
This is nothing to do with Judaism. This is fundamentalist Christianity, fundamentalist Islam. All the Abrahamic religions in their fundamentalist wing are saying the same thing, and it's flat contradictory to scientific evidence. I mean, I'm not
That's
ready
what
to...
I'm saying. Science has its purpose. When it comes to empirical issues, Judaism has tremendous respect for science. As far as this issue is concerned, we do not see this as being empirical. We see this as science trying to garb itself in the religion.
But how can it not be empirical? We're talking about the age of the Earth. What could be more empirical than the fact?
But the fact is that neither you or I were present when the world came into being.
Well, of course not. But the evidence
And therefore the evidence, we can question the evidence. We can question what actually happened, as science does. Different branches of science see what happened then from a different perspective and with real different fundamental differences between different branches of science. That in itself intimates that science in itself has no knowledge. It just has theories or hypotheses about what happened.
I was offering you a different interpretation, a mythic one, which you didn't take. But as for different scientists disagreeing, scientists disagree somewhat, but all scientists agree that the world is billions of years old and not 5,000 years
Good,
old.
but still, there are differences of billions of years between different branches of science.
Well, some people might say 5 billion and some might say 4 billion.
And it's a billion years is a long time.
Well, it is a long time, but nevertheless...
Much more than what we're talking about here. I mean, a billion years.
The methods of measuring are such that there's a certain margin of error.
So,
But
but a billion years, I mean, I think is more than margin of error. It's something very fundamental. 1,000 million years. That's what you're talking about.
I am talking about that, it's no surprise that the methods of dating. As a matter of fact, I'm exaggerating when I said 4 or 5 billion. The consensus is very, very close now to agreeing that it's 4.6 billion years. But again, there would be a few million years.
A few million years is also nothing to be trifled with.
No, but you're making a very facile point, if I may say so, aren't you? And you know it, because when you're dealing with these huge, great distances...
But what we're dealing with here is that one can't say that science has knowledge about it, that it has an empirical view on it. It's a theoretical view on it.
There are quite a lot of different radioactive clocks which enable us to estimate the age of the Earth. And they all give slightly different answers, but only slightly different answers. And they all point to an answer which is in the region.
When it has different answers, that in itself shows that this isn't a foolproof way of dating something, because it gives different answers.
How
I mean, if
accurate
you have all of us in this room all giving different accounts of what happened 5 minutes ago, we're going to start asking questions. Hang on a second, what actually did happen?
Yes.
Because they all have different views.
As you yourself said, we were none of us there. This is a very long time ago. When you're dealing with timescales in the billions, then the margin of error that you would expect would be in the millions. When you're dealing with timescales in the thousands, then the margin of error that you would expect might be in the centuries. So if you were trying to use biblical methods to date the origin of the universe, then you might say, well, I think it's 5,000, whatever it was you said, and some other teacher might say, well, I think it's a little bit less, a little bit more. You expect to have that sort of margin of error with any method of dating or timing. When we're dealing with billions of years, then you do not expect to have the same sort of precision as you get when you're saying that the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1066. You can't do it to more accurate than, say, the nearest 100 million years,
So,
which is a long time, as you say.
But you are saying that there isn't any foolproof way of dating, because each way of dating has its issues, has its problems.
Any system of dating is foolproof within a certain margin of error. And the margin of error that we're talking about, it may be measured in hundreds of millions of years. That's still relatively small compared with billions. So within the margin of error that science acknowledges fully that it has, the age of the Earth is to be measured, the order of magnitude of the age of the Earth is billions of years. It's not thousands of years. And it's not just scientists.
But that depends on the view that the world started from a single cell, or from... But if, as we do in Judaism, we believe that God created a finished world, in other words, that there wasn't a need for this development to take this time in order to... So therefore, I think we're talking about a different set of circumstances.
A finished world, meaning with rocks full of fossils that look as though they...
Yes. And then, in other words, that there was a great amount of radioactivity within the world at the point of creation.
Yes. So, I mean, God could certainly have created the world 5,000 years ago and made it look as though it was 4.5 billion, 4.6 billion. But do you think that's what he did? I mean, that's almost like trying to deceive us, isn't it?
Not trying to deceive us. That God wanted us to start off at this point. In other words, that God's purpose was that we should find ourselves in this world and actually make a good thing of this world. I mean, it's man within the thousands of years has been very challenged. We've been very challenged even in the past century, and in this century again. And I think that God wanted us to work within a certain time frame to try our best to make the world a good place. Because in Judaism we look at man and God as a partnership. God says we are his partner in creation. So this is also part of creation.
Let me come back to education. And the point I made a while ago, that it's a sort of accident that this child happens to have been brought up in a Jewish household, that child in a Christian, that one in a Muslim. Why should children be victims of the particular tradition in which they happen to have been born, rather than choosing for themselves by being shown all the evidence that's available?
I think I wouldn't use the word victim necessarily, unless someone wants to choose that word. But we are all, to a certain extent, affected by our surroundings. There's no such thing as a person living in a vacuum.
Indeed.
We're all affected by our parents, by our families,
yes, by
our surroundings, by various experiences that we have over the years. So therefore, to say that that we type of born and cloned and put in a groove, and that is who we are and what we are, and we have no choice. I think that is...
You're clearly right. I mean, that we get our taste in music, our taste in football teams or whatever it might be.
Which football team do you support?
I don't. I'm not interested in football.
Not interested
I know
in
you
football.
do. I know you do. But it is true that that children, of course, take in by, you use the word osmosis, all sorts of things. However, when it comes to truths, fundamental truths, you were talking about scientists disagreeing just a moment ago, and of course they do. But a scientist would never say, I believe that the world is 5 billion years old because I belong to the tradition of Professor so-and-so who believes it's 5 billion. Another one says, I belong to the tradition of Professor so-and-so who believes it's 4 billion.
But there are differences between looking at the world through biology or through astronomy or through various branches of science regarding the age of the world. In other words, if someone belongs to this tradition or to this department in a university which is into astronomy, the major view over there would be so-and-so because that's an astronomical view. And so on different branches.
They're not like traditions, though, are they? It's true that astronomical evidence may give a slightly different answer from biological evidence, and then we would have to look at them and say, well, which one is right? But what we don't say is, I believe so-and-so because I belong to the astronomical tradition. You say, I believe so-and-so because I've looked at the evidence and...
Within the astronomical...
Well, I mean, within my own field of evolutionary biology, there is controversy. People disagree about various things. People disagree about, say, why the dinosaurs went extinct. Some think it was the meteorite that hit the Earth, and others think it was the rise of the mammals or something. You never hear a scientist say, I think it was a meteorite because I belong to the meteorite tradition.
No, but,
you say, I believe in the meteorite.
But there are those who look at it from a biological view, as you just said, and those from an astronomical view, and many other views. In other words, there are various mindsets within the scientific community based on which part of the scientific community one comes from.
Well, of course there are. They are very different from traditions, though.
So,
a couple of years ago, and it happens frequently in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, there were horrific scenes of Catholic children being pelted with abuse and stones and things as they were trying to go to school by Protestant mobs, and it happens both ways. I worry about labelling children Catholic children and Protestant children, or Muslim children or Jewish children, because they are being segregated in a world where there is a lot of tension, and in Northern Ireland it's particularly bad, where for centuries Catholics have stayed apart from Protestants, and Protestants stayed apart from Catholics, nearly always marrying within the community, education strictly controlled within the community, so that there is the opportunity for a divergence, for a division of what should be one civilized community, a divergence into two. So there are traditional enmities, which go back to William III, go back to Oliver Cromwell, and
I'm so sorry. We have to pick it, but yeah, that'd be great. Okay, we'll probably start beeping for being off the hook. So if you start on the point of divergence,
yes.
Yeah, you're...
Sorry about that.
Wait a second. Okay, and... Yeah.
So for centuries there's been a sort of systematically nurtured divergence in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, between Catholics and Protestants, and it's done by education, it's done by tradition that goes back many generations. Does that worry you at all when you see the children, the Jewish children? I mean, does it worry you to actually call a child a Jewish child rather than a child of Jewish parents who may wish to become Jewish when he grows older?
I think identity, we all have identities. You have your name, I have my name. That in itself sets us apart as having two separate identities. I mean, I'm sure you would hate to be me and I would hate to be you because we cherish our individuality. And same thing as far as groups are concerned. We choose to be members of groups. We are born within...
We're born into
We are born with...
Yeah.
Each one of us is born into a certain family, into a certain group. But at the same time, we have a choice to stay or otherwise. And that is, and because we think and we reflect and we struggle with ourselves, each one of us, hopefully. And then we make choices in life. Each one of us makes general choices and particular choices. Going to the point that you mentioned, I think that the very tragic conflict in Northern Ireland isn't based on religion. I'm sure that you've studied history, and it's got to do with politics, with the politics of the British state and the Irish state, the identity of Ireland, which goes back 1,000 years, but Britain has had parts of Ireland have been parts of Britain longer than much longer than Scotland has been, the area around Dublin. And there are political elements, nationalistic elements, which are at the core of the Protestant Catholic divide in Ireland, because of course there are other parts of the world where Protestants and Catholics live rather well together.
Yes.
In Ireland, I think it's not so much to do with religion. as to do with nationalistic identity. I mean, if we look at societies where there was no religion, communist societies, I mean, there were wars between atheistic states in Southeast Asia,
yes,
within
I
Europe.
think that all that's correct, and I think you're right about the history of Ireland. Nevertheless, to take children and say, you are a Protestant child, you are a Catholic child, you will go to a Protestant school, you will go to a Catholic school, and learn history differently. I mean, can't you see some enormous benefit in putting the children into the same school?
I studied British history, and I think that what I studied as a Brit was very different to the way the French studied the same periods in history, or the Germans studied the same. And we'll go even further, even the beautiful alliance between the USA and Britain, the way that they look at their history and the way we look at British history within America, it is totally different.
It is.
So therefore, whatever way you're looking at it, there are different perspectives on society. Even if you say we should have a European history, it's still going to be different to Chinese history or North American history.
Yes.
The way, so I think there's always going to be the issue of identity. I think we can't live in a vacuum. There's always going to be identity. The question is what identity? But there's always going to be different identities based on various factors within the human condition.
You're quite right, of course, about national identities, and French children will doubtless learn history very differently from English children, and there are language differences and all sorts of things. But in a place like Northern Ireland, although the fighting is not about religion, the segregation is about religion. There's no other difference between them.
I don't think, and I hope he doesn't sue me for this, that Jerry Adams has been to a church recently, or Martin McGuinness has been to a church recently.
I think that's right.
I don't think it's got to do with religion.
No.
I think it's got to do with nationalism, which nationalism we saw in the last century is the most dangerous element in the human condition. I mean, in the 20th century, we had the worst atrocities in human history, and I think you'll agree with me on this, committed by two ideologies that were anti-religious, that were atheistic. The Nazis, National Socialism, and Communism, who both totally rejected religion, and then they went on to commit atrocities, barbaric acts, the most inhuman behavior of man against man.
It certainly was very inhuman, and it's an arguable point whether Hitler was religious or not. And
he certainly was. He might have been pagan religion,
like
but
that.
he was certainly, and even that is highly questionable, as I'm sure you're aware. But he was certainly against the Judaic ethos of religion.
He certainly was. I mean, insofar as Hitler had a religion at all, he was a Roman Catholic.
Yeah, but he certainly wasn't.
He wasn't a very
I mean, if anything, he toyed with German paganism, with Eastern paganism.
Yes.
But he wasn't a religious person in the context as we understand.
I would have thought he invented his own religion, a sort of sub-Wagnerian. Anyway, I wanted to get back to the children, because it does seem to me that in a place like Northern Ireland, where they haven't got different languages, they live in the same country, they speak the same language, they look the same, the only thing that's separating them is segregated education in Protestant schools and Catholic schools. Don't you think it's actually quite likely that if, with a wave of the wand, you could abolish sectarian schools in Northern Ireland and have all the children going to the same schools? It would take a generation, but don't you think that after that generation you would no longer have the hideous conflicts that you have in Northern Ireland?
I think after 7/7 that this argument is rather facile, excuse me saying so, because the bombers in 7/7 were actually people who went to state schools. Muslim kids who went together with Christian kids, together with people from all different backgrounds. And it didn't seem to prevent the terrible scenes that we saw. So I don't think the issue is going to a different school.
Well,
the issue is being able to be comfortable with oneself and to be so comfortable with yourself that you can let someone else into yourself. And I think that is the issue.
Well, I think you could well be right about the schools, and I mean that makes me even more pessimistic, because it suggests, if you're right, that integrated schooling wouldn't help. But the reason I would think that it wouldn't help is that the influence of outside of school religious activity. The bombers of 7/7 were devout Muslims. And so it was, and I don't know whether they had separate schools or not.
No, they
but
didn't.
I'm
They
quite
all,
sure
they all went to state schools.
they all went to state
Yes.
schools, but they certainly would have had.
One of them even taught in a state school.
They certainly would have had instruction in Islam, which would have been separate from the instruction. I think that simply shows how immensely powerful religious instruction can be.
Actually, I've spoken to inspectors, Her Majesty's inspectors, and they say that actually schools they don't have a problem with. They find that religious schools, single-faith schools, the children come out very rounded. It's those children that go to state schools that they sometimes have issues with.
Right.
Regarding their attitudes towards the other.
Yes. Well, then where do you think those bombers got their fanatical loyalty to Islam from?
I think from being marginalized, from not being in touch with themselves, not having a clear identity. When a person is fragmented within themselves, they tend to cause fragmentation within society. So therefore, I think to have a clear idea of identity is so important for a person to succeed in life and to integrate with others.
So every child should be brought up with a clear identity, with a tradition. It doesn't matter which tradition, as long as it is an ancient tradition which they feel they can belong to and have a clear identity with.
I think if one knows who one is, it is easier to identify and to make peace with someone who has a different identity, because there are two clear identities who are meeting with each other. I think when there's a lack of that, I think in the 60s, I mean, this is a bit different, but no, there was the Yoko Ono I was a kid in the 60s, but I still remember clearly, and was very touched by Yoko Ono picking up the phone to random people saying, "I love you." Yoko, it's very easy to say to a random person, "I love you." The difficult thing is to say to someone who's close to you, "I love you." And I think that is the issue. The issue is actually engaging with the other as an other. And despite the differences, to be able to find a point where one can meet and work together.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I enjoyed talking to Rabbi Gluck, and I thought he made some very good points. The value of tradition and the fact that we, all of us, whether we like it or not, are brought up in a tradition surrounded by our parents and our culture and so on. What I'm not so happy about is the labelling of children gratuitously as Jewish children, Christian children, Muslim children, Catholic children, whatever it might be, and systematically segregating education over and above the ordinary differences that inevitably we're all subjected to.